and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, our focus is Ukraine as peace negotiations continue following on from talks in Saudi Arabia. We're going to be speaking to Kurt Volker. He was President Trump's former envoy to Ukraine. We'll be asking him about his hopes for peace. Plus, we'll be speaking to a former director for US national security to get his assessment on the chances for peace. Hello and welcome to the program. Today we have our eye firmly focused on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Well, in a recent interview, President Vladimir Putin stated that Russia has sufficient strength and resources to take the war in Ukraine to what he described as a logical conclusion, emphasizing he'll be able to do so without the need for nuclear weapons.
They
wanted to provoke us. As you said it yourself, they wanted us to make mistakes. There was no need to use the weapons you spoke about, and I hope they will not be required. We have enough strength and means to bring what was started in 2022 to a logical conclusion with the outcome Russia requires.
Well, President Putin also added that he is constantly thinking about his eventual successor. Well, the 72-year-old Russian president, who is the longest-serving Kremlin leader since Joseph Stalin, said there should be several candidates so that people have a real choice. Well, President Putin's statements come as his US counterpart, President Donald Trump, once again reiterated that he could pull out of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia if the two sides failed to make progress. Well, President Trump said he might just let Russia and Ukraine, quote, keep being stupid.
How long do you give both countries before you're going to walk away?
Well, there'll be a time when I will say, okay, keep going, keep being stupid.
When does that come? Are you close to it?
Sometimes I get close to it and then positive things happen, okay?
What's the red line for you? At what point do you say, that's it, we're walking away?
Well, you'll know. I mean, there'll be a time when I may say that. And if I do, there may be something I can't, maybe it's not possible to do. There's tremendous hatred, just so you understand. Krista, we're talking tremendous hatred between these two men and between, you know, some of the soldiers, frankly, between the generals. They've been fighting hard for 3 years. I think we have a very good chance of doing.
Let's get more now. We can speak to Kurt Volker, the former US ambassador to NATO. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Ambassador. You served as President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine during the first Trump administration. That was a voluntary role that you held for about 2 years. I'm assuming you've been following this conflict and the situation in Ukraine now, well, for the best part of a decade. And I want to start by asking you, where are we? Are we at the beginning of the end yet?
I think we are at the beginning of a phase that will take us back to a ceasefire. We had a ceasefire nominally, not always respected by Russia, but nominally a ceasefire from 2014 until 2022. And then we had, of course, Russia's full-scale invasion in 22. I think we are heading back now toward a ceasefire in place.
I mean, we heard...
if I can add, just to add to that, I know there's a lot of talk about a peace deal or an agreement. I think that is far less likely. I think we can have a ceasefire where future attacks are refrained from and deterred, but an actual peace agreement I'm very skeptical about.
Okay, so some sort of a scaling down seems to be what you're saying in terms of,
yes,
of the tensions. We're getting slightly mixed messages from Washington. I mean, on the one hand, we heard President Trump say at the weekend that there's been some great progress being made and that he's very happy with the talks that have been made. And then we hear from the US Vice President speaking to Fox News 3 days ago saying there's going to be no end to the war anytime soon. I mean, how do we decode these slightly conflicting views?
Yeah, I think President Trump is always trying to talk up the prospects of a deal to keep optimism, to keep trying to find ways to engage Vladimir Putin, get him into a process so that he is willing to try to end the war. I think J.D. Vance is just being realistic that Putin is not interested in ending the war. He wants to keep fighting the war. And we haven't got him in a position yet where he feels that that's necessary. As I said, though, I think towards the end of this year, he will start feeling that. His foreign exchange reserves are going to be running lower and lower, especially as the price of oil is down and as sanctions and possibly secondary sanctions take effect. And he also doesn't want to launch a full-scale conscription in Russia. But without that, he's not going to have the manpower that he needs if he's going to keep taking losses at the rate that he is today.
So in terms of the right moment to bring about meaningful negotiations, I mean, if Russia's kind of got the upper hand on the battlefield right now, but is going to be feeling the heat towards the end of the year, doesn't it make sense, therefore, to perhaps revisit diplomatic efforts later on in the year?
I think that is exactly where Rubio and J.D. Vance are headed in their thinking, that it's fruitless, as Rubio said, to just fly around the world for meetings right now if Putin is not going to be serious about ending the conflict. Put the pressure on, apply secondary sanctions, keep assistance flowing to Ukraine, possibly if Congress enacts legislation that enables Ukraine to borrow from the United States and then buy American weapons. Those would all be things that would send a signal to Putin that this is going to last a long time and it's going to get worse and worse for him. Then perhaps later in the year, there would be a time to resume negotiations, at least in order to get a full ceasefire.
It's quite interesting because what you're saying also ties into some of the comments that have come out of the Kremlin in the last couple of days. They've said the conflict is so complicated and the speed of progress that Washington wants is unrealistic. I mean, there seems to be a perception, therefore, in Russia that the United States doesn't really understand the complexities of this conflict. Do you think they've got a point?
Well, I would never take Kremlin statements at face value. They are saying these things in order to influence others, not because they are reflecting any particular truth. And the reason the Kremlin is saying that it's quite complex is to give a justification for why they are not agreeing to an immediate ceasefire. Fact is, they just don't want to agree to an immediate ceasefire. They want to continue fighting. They just don't want to say that. So they say it's complex.
You're quoted as saying that this Trump administration is much faster than the first Trump administration. I just want to ask you, I mean, obviously faster, everyone will agree, there's been a flurry of activity. But in terms of results, what is there to show for it?
Honestly, I'd say results in some areas, like immigration, have been remarkable. Been a 99% decrease in illegal border crossings.
Okay, but in terms of foreign policy?
Well, that's one. In terms of tariffs, I'd say the results are the opposite. They have actually done damage to the markets and the U.S. economy, and we're now in a first quarter of what could be a recession as a decline in GNP in the first quarter after Trump took office. So that's been an effect. And in terms of some of these conflicts, I think in the case of Russia and Ukraine, he has gotten the U.S. and Ukraine in alignment, both about calling for an immediate ceasefire and developing a common approach to developing Ukraine's economic resources, which is sustainable, which involves the United States as a partner in developing Ukraine, gives the U.S. a stake in Ukraine, and this alignment in turn sends a signal to Putin. So that much has been done. But when it comes to stopping the fighting, I think Ukraine has done more on its own than anything the U.S. has done by, for example, the naval drones that they have developed or the frontline drones that they use, which have really inhibited Russia from making any substantial gains anymore. And then finally, in the Middle East, I think that they have caused Iran to start looking at options. They have gone after the Houthis and given a green light to Israel on Hamas, which I think has shown much greater resolve to push back on Iran's proxies than the Biden administration was doing. That does open the possibility for ratcheting down the conflict in the Middle East.
And Ambassador, just to pick up on what you're saying about the so-called minerals deal, as it's been dubbed in the media, are you satisfied that that minerals deal does offer security guarantees to Ukraine?
Well, no, it doesn't offer security guarantees. It doesn't
None.
pretend to. It is an economic deal, but which establishes a reconstruction investment fund. But what it does do is it gives the U.S. a stake in Ukraine's survival, its territory, its prosperity, its functioning as an independent European state. So while it doesn't provide any guarantees, it does create an interest in the U.S., which the U.S. has a reason to act upon in terms of future security assistance for Ukraine. And that is going to be matched by other security assurances coming from European allies, continued military support, equipment, and training for Ukraine, and possibly even a European reassurance force deployed to Ukraine. So it is in alignment with those things, but the security guarantees are not in this agreement.
Knowing, as you do, and correct me if I'm wrong, both presidents, we've been discussing here, President Trump on the one hand and President Zelensky on the other. I mean, one of the remarkable things we've seen these last few weeks of the second Trump administration has been, their relationship reaching occasionally boiling point in front of the world media. How would you characterize the state of their ties right now? Have they put their hostilities behind them? Have the fences been mended, would you say?
I think so. I think that the meeting that they had in the Vatican seemed to be very positive, and they both spoke very positively about it. It's good that they kept the details private. I think that Zelensky just got into an argument with Vice President Vance unnecessarily in the Oval Office, and it left Trump with an impression that Zelensky just wants to continue the war. It took a few weeks to unwind those impressions and get the U.S. back in alignment. And part of doing that was the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, and his counterpart in Ukraine, the Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Svyrydenko. They were able to do a lot more work behind the scenes and with much less emotion and produce the result that we have now.
Yeah, and we're about 105 days, I believe, into the second Trump administration. And when you think about scenes like what we saw in the Oval Office, the sort of the public showdown, dressing down of President Zelensky in front of the world media, how do you think Ukraine's allies, and indeed Washington's traditional allies, felt about the treatment the United States was giving the visiting president?
Well, first off, I've spoken with a lot of people about that, and the majority of people that I've met didn't understand what happened, as I see it. They viewed this as an attack on President Zelensky, maybe even a premeditated attack. That's not what happened. If you watch the video carefully, President Trump is having this chummy kind of chat with President Zelensky for about 30 minutes. And then he says, let's wrap it up. One more question. And instead of there being a question, J.D. Vance speaks up because he had not said anything throughout the entire meeting. He wanted to be on camera and seen to be relevant. That should have ended the meeting. President Zelensky should have just, taken the cue from his counterpart, President Trump, to wrap up the meeting and go have lunch. But instead, he then started arguing with J.D. Vance, and the meeting spiraled out of control from there. Really unfortunate, but not a setup against President Zelensky. It did, however, as I said, have a consequence in that President Trump came away thinking that if we give more aid to Ukraine, they just want to use it to keep fighting. And that's not the point of our aid. The point is to end the war. So we had to go through a lot of back and forth with Ukraine after that meeting to get things back on track. But I think we have now done that.
I mean, there is a bit of history, isn't there, between President Zelensky and President Trump, but not all of it necessarily relating to chapters both men would look back on with great affection. I mean, do you think fundamentally there's a bit of a clash of characters here, knowing both men as you do?
Well, President Trump always wants to be the dominant figure. He wants to be the one who is calling all the shots. And in the way he speaks, in the way he handles a meeting, he's just a bully. President Zelensky always wants to argue. He wants to make the case about why Ukraine is important, why Ukraine needs assistance, why Ukraine is fighting to defend the front lines of the West and so forth. So if people don't immediately accept those arguments, he feels the need to argue. So that just sets up a bad dynamic in conversation, which they need to be careful about. As you say, they've had many meetings. They had a very good meeting in New York in September of last year. That followed, however, on President Zelensky visiting a factory in Pennsylvania, which turned into a Democrat campaign stop, making the Republicans very unhappy. During the impeachment process back in 2019, Trump was very pleased with President Zelensky for not throwing him under the bus and saying he felt no pressure from President Trump at all. They were just having a conversation. So they've had these ups and downs, as you say, but I think they are both strong leaders and are in a spot now where they have aligned their interests.
Do you think President Trump's right to want to bring about some sort of rapprochement with the Russians? I mean, and what's in it for the United States?
Well, I think what President Trump is thinking about is avoiding World War III. How do we avoid getting into a confrontation with Russia? And if we can instead build a positive relationship and positive business relationships with Russia. Every president that has taken office that I've seen has tried to do that, whether it was President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama with his reset policy, first term Trump, President Biden, and now Trump second, Trump 2.0. They all do that. I think it is misguided, to be honest, because Russia takes advantage of that, sees it as weakness, wants to exploit our engagement in order to pursue its aggression.
Do you think President Putin actually wants peace?
No, I don't. I think he wants to conquer Ukraine. He doesn't believe that Ukraine is a legitimate, sovereign, independent country. He believes that they should be part of Russia. He believes that Ukraine is Russian land, and he intends to take all of it and to oppose a government that he chooses. So no, he does not want peace.
And where does it stop after Ukraine? Does he have his eye, do you think, on territorial enlargement?
Ukraine is the big, first, most important thing.
And then?
And if he succeeds there, he will be turning his attention to the Baltic states, possibly to Finland, possibly to a corridor linking Belarus and Russia with Kaliningrad, which is otherwise an island of Russian territory, possibly even Poland. So he has a lot of appetite. And if he is successful in Ukraine and then rebuilds, he will then be looking elsewhere for where to satisfy that appetite.
Do you think the Trump administration understands and appreciates the danger of escalation beyond Ukraine? Because we're starting to get very close, aren't we, and we are talking already now about NATO member states potentially being eyed up by a hostile Russia.
Yeah, well, there are several things. When you say understand the dangers, I think one thing is that they are very focused on the danger of a direct NATO-Russia confrontation, because that could escalate into a very large war, including with nuclear weapons. So they are sensitive to that. I think they downplay the risk of Russia attacking one of these smaller NATO allies to test our will to see whether we would indeed respond, because I think they have some doubts about that. So I think they underestimate that risk.
You mentioned nuclear weapons. President Putin said at the weekend that he hopes we won't have to use them in Ukraine. What message is he sending out there, do you think?
Yeah, well, of course, we share that hope. And
why bring it up?
Every time he brings up nuclear weapons, he's doing it in order to play a psychological operation against the West, because the idea of any use of nuclear weapons is so scary and could lead to a nuclear exchange that people think that, oh, we mustn't go too far. We have to appease Russia somehow. And so that's why he brings it up. He wants to be appeased. And I think we have to be very strong, determined, and not overreact to these things that he says when he is rattling that nuclear saber.
So in terms of your level of optimism and hope that some sort of a deal beyond this 72-hour unilateral ceasefire, which we're going to see later on this week, beyond that, how hopeful are you some sort of a deal could be struck this year?
Well, first off, I don't think we're going to see a 72-hour ceasefire
Even this
later
week?
this week. I could be wrong, but Putin has proposed it unilaterally. Ukraine did not agree to that, saying it is an insignificant step. We need a permanent ceasefire. Putin only proposed this in order to protect Moscow while he's having his big military parade. So it's a rather self-serving gesture, not really a humanitarian gesture about the war. So I don't put a lot of stock in this week's ceasefire. As for a longer and more durable, permanent, full-scale ceasefire, I do think we will get there. I think Putin will need that at some point. He's just not ready to do it now. He needs to feel more pain in his economy and more military setbacks on the ground.
And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, we sometimes speak to senior figures in the Republican Party, senior figures in the Trump administration, who say things that sound very close to the lines to take that the Kremlin might be issuing. Words to the effect that President Zelensky is not a legitimate leader, that elections must be held immediately, that the West provoked this war in the first place. What do you think about this? I mean, do you think there is an element of perhaps, misguided sympathy for quite a lot of Moscow's opinions there in the ranks of the leadership in the United States?
I think there's just a lot of confusion. There are many people who feel that the U.S. has done too much for Ukraine already, spent too much money on military equipment and provided that to Ukraine without any strategic result. So their policy desire is to cut off aid to Ukraine. And so in order to justify that policy desire, they look around for reasons. And a lot of these reasons that the Kremlin has provided are convenient, so they just say these things without really knowing anything about the situation.
And just lastly, I don't know if you still have the ear of President Trump, but supposing you do, what advice would you give him and his administration to bring about a conclusion to this war?
Well, the way I would see it is, first off, he's done a good job of getting the U.S. and Ukraine aligned. And he has given Putin every opportunity, every inducement, every enticement to go along with a ceasefire. And Putin has rejected him. So it is time for a different approach, which is to increase the pressure on Russia. And that would take the form of secondary sanctions on their oil and gas industry and on banking institutions. And also to support Congress providing a program to lend money to Ukraine so Ukraine can buy American weapons and ammunition without it being a burden on U.S. taxpayers, but without cutting off that vital supply line. Those are the things that I would do now. Then in terms of negotiations, I would not recognize any territory that Russia has seized as legitimately Russian territory. This is all occupation. And anytime you recognize something like that, you open the door to other countries seeking to do the same thing. So I would not do that. And I would also not take NATO membership off the table. Putin may well relaunch the war again. There may be more misbehavior. We can't predict how things are going to go in the future. So if we're not ready to bring Ukraine into NATO today, then just don't say anything and just leave that out there as an option for the future if NATO and Ukraine later decide that it is necessary.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you so much. It's been really interesting talking to you. Kurt Volker, former US ambassador to NATO. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Michael Allen, the former director of the National Security Council under President George W. Bush, now the managing director of Beacon Global Strategies. Michael, great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed for your time. There's loads of things we can talk about, but I just want to pick up, first of all, on some comments made by President Putin on Sunday. He said he hopes that the need to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine will not arise. And I just wondered, first of all, why you think he's saying that?
I think he's trying to get additional leverage over the West. I think this is designed to frighten European publics, maybe to put them into a way to support President Trump's peace initiatives. I also think it's a bit of saber rattling to give him a little bit more leverage, because of late, President Trump has been more critical of Russia and their obstinance toward a ceasefire than he has of Ukraine. And I think this is a little bit of way for Putin to get leverage back over his adversaries.
And one of the other things that President Putin said, he said that Russia has the strength and the means to bring the conflict in Ukraine to what he called a logical conclusion. What means and what conclusion do you think he's talking about here?
So in this instance, I think what he's referring to is the fact that Russia's economy is now on a wartime footing. That was the congressional testimony recently from U.S. Supreme Allied Commander Chris Cavoli. And I think it's a bit of news, because of late, everyone has assumed that Russia is back on its heels. And it's true that they are not making substantial military progress going forward. But what this speaks to is that Russia may have the ability over the medium and long term to keep the fight going. So I think this is another reason why the West needs to really step up, enhance its defense industrial base in Europe and in the United States, and continue to bolster Ukraine's security by way of military assistance.
Okay, does that military security and assistance come part and parcel, I think, with the minerals deal that's been agreed on?
Yeah, I think so, because I wouldn't necessarily have thought that was the case, except that Donald Trump has mentioned that this is a way to get the United States interested in Ukraine's security. And it makes sense when you consider Donald Trump's sort of philosophy and style, which is that first and foremost, he is into and really respects economic strength. He wants the United States to take a more strong role around the world of economic prowess. He is aware that the United States has some needs for greater critical minerals. And so he looked at Ukraine and said, this is the U.S. national interest. It's mostly of an economic concern, but I think that works for Ukraine. If Donald Trump is interested in the future security and economic health of Ukraine because the United States is there, then I think that's good news for both parties and definitely our European allies.
Michael, it looks still, doesn't it, and correct me if you think differently, that we're still quite a long way off from a 30-day cessation of hostilities, which was the first goal that the US diplomatic effort sort of put in front of itself. But we do have coming up ahead of us this week a 72-hour unilateral ceasefire that's been announced by Russia, mostly to mark Victory Day in the Second World War. I mean, does that give you some optimism?
I don't think that the Russians are in a mood for any types of compromise whatsoever. It's Putin who of late has been adding preconditions just to the idea of a temporary ceasefire. Ukraine has said that they support it and they would move into it immediately. But I just don't think the Russians are there. I think they believe that their incremental progress is enough for them to continue going forward. And they're trying to leverage the president's proclivities towards trying to be fair to Russia to win concessions, such as the complete control of these 4 oblasts or provinces that the Russians don't even completely occupy or hold now. So they're trying to get concessions before the negotiations even begin. So I agree with you. I think we're a long way off from a real substantive ceasefire, to say nothing of the longer term issues that we would need to be able to make progress on for a peace agreement.
Yeah, so 3 months of pretty intense diplomatic efforts by the Trump administration. They've clearly put a lot of time and effort into trying to broker some sort of agreement between the two sides. Have they got anything they can show, in your opinion, as a win from these last 3 months?
Well, I think it's good that we, the United States, have attempted in good faith to make progress with the Russians, because I think it's very instructive as to the way that they want to be able to do business. So I'm glad Steve Witkoff, who has the complete confidence of the president, has been to the Kremlin to meet with Vladimir Putin. And I think it's important for us to hear them out on what their aims are. But if they're continuing to be the ones who want to keep the fight going, after all, they're the ones that started it, I think this is instructive for the United States and the delegation moving forward that Russia may not be in the mood for a ceasefire whatsoever. I don't believe that Putin's base case has been satisfied, which is that he wants Ukraine to be impotent, if not Russia control all of its territory, because Putin wants a veto on their security arrangements going forward. We know he definitely doesn't want them to be in NATO. He doesn't want NATO troops stationed in Ukraine as a tripwire ceasefire type of arrangement. And so I think this is part of the ongoing negotiations that need to go forward. And I think it's part of figuring out where everybody sits as we try and shake things out.
Do you see a scenario in which, for example, no ceasefire can be brokered by the United States, but the United States says, even so, we're going to push ahead with our rapprochement with Moscow? Could they do that, do you think?
Yeah, I think it makes sense for us to try to have some sort of détente with Russia. I just have doubts that it's actually achievable. Donald Trump has said on numerous occasions, it wouldn't be a bad thing if the United States got along better with Russia. There are other issues that we can work with around the globe, maybe even the Iran nuclear program. But I do think this is a very hard case to get Vladimir Putin into a place where he would stop hostilities towards Ukraine. And it's my view that even if we got into a place where we had an extended ceasefire, he would use that time to rebuild and reconstitute and rearm so that he could begin a war with Ukraine again in the future. Now, maybe he wouldn't do it under Donald Trump because Putin would have some respect for Vladimir Putin. But Putin's track record is to take a rest, rebuild its military, and then come back at the target. After all, they did this in Ukraine from 2014, and then remember, fast forward to 2022, and they've done it in Chechnya, even in Georgia. So I don't know that I have a great deal of confidence that a ceasefire would lead to a permanent peace. It's worth trying. I'm glad the president is going there, but I don't have a high degree of confidence that it'll be ultimately successful. I think the president's starting to feel that way as well, because that's why he's saying, you know what, if neither of these parties are serious about peace, I don't want to sit and use all of America's time trying to broker two recalcitrant parties together.
Okay, so what happens in that scenario? The Americans walk away from the table and what? Just leave Russia and Ukraine to carry on fighting and until what?
So, first of all, it would need the Ukrainians would need additional military assistance. And so we need to know going forward, is the president going to continue to provide that? I think he would, based on some of the comments that he's made. I don't think he wants to own Ukraine being crushed by the Russians like Biden owned Afghanistan being crushed by the Taliban, because he was headstrong and rushed out of the country despite warnings. So I don't think he would cut off military assistance, but to me, that's the major hinge point on what this looks like going forward. For them to be able to get to eventual peace talks, I think would need Russia to believe that they no longer can have any success whatsoever, or the economic pressure got so great that it felt like the economy was going to completely collapse. Russia has been adaptable so far. They're resilient. But so right now, I don't see a scenario where they feel like they need to make a lasting peace agreement. It would just need, I'm afraid, many, many more months of fighting before the two parties decided, you know what, this is absolutely fruitless, and let's go back to the United States and try and get them to impose some sort of ceasefire and later a peace agreement upon us.
Okay, so what's the right way forward from this administration? Appeasement, rapprochement, whatever we want to call it, and perhaps make a friendship, bring about a friendship and better trust between Moscow and Washington, or going the other way and going exactly the opposite direction and really turning up the heat even more, trying to potentially sink the Russian economy, inflict as much damage as possible, create some internal strife, all the other tactics that could be used. Which is the one that's most likely to bear fruit?
Well, I think the third option that you mentioned, more pressure on the Russians to make meaningful concessions, is the way to go. I do believe, however, that the president is trying to pursue better relations with Russia, and he correctly realizes that Russia-Ukraine is the major issue in the world and definitely in bilateral relations with the United States. But I think he's determined, or he's beginning to determine, that the Russians are not ready to even go to a ceasefire. So this means they'll continue to apply pressure. I think we, the United States, would apply additional pressure on Russia to condition them to come to the table and maybe lower their demands in order to join into a ceasefire. I think that's what the president ultimately will do. The president talks about how he understands leverage. I think he'll have to deploy more leverage. The newspapers occasionally say that he understands he may need to do what he would call tariffs, sometimes what we might call sanctions. Either way, just to ensure moving forward that he's putting pressure on Russia to come to the peace table.
There's rumors circulating that President Trump and President Putin could be set to meet during the course of the coming days or weeks, although the Kremlin seems to suggest there's nothing in the diary at this particular moment. I mean, how likely do you think that is, and how meaningful would that meeting be, do you think?
I think the president's really open to meeting with foreign leaders, and he doesn't always subscribe to sort of the diplomatic view of, I really need to have a deliverable, or we really need to be announcing something big. I don't think he wants to do it in the short term, because I think he wants things to continue and at least be on the path to a ceasefire before he meets with Putin. But the president, I think, believes that he has a considerable amount of influence over leaders when he can get into the room with them. So I wouldn't doubt that that's in the president's mind, although I don't think it's in the short term. I could maybe see it this summer or late summer into the fall, if there's any reason whatsoever for them to celebrate a ceasefire or to get close to clinching it.
Just lastly, we've been talking about how President Trump's approach to diplomacy is slightly unorthodox. It's not the traditional US approach. But do you think perhaps there's an argument that a non-traditional, unorthodox approach is exactly what's needed with a conflict like this?
So I'm glad the president's doing it. I mean, I'm more of the view that people don't make concessions based purely on good relationships with other countries. I think it really comes down to national interest, broadly defined, and the subtle application of pressure to win meaningful concessions and yield progress towards an outcome. So I like the idea of him trying and building a rapport. I think that could be useful. But at the end of the day, I think the only way to be able to get nations to move, not just Russia, but in other instances, is to be tough, apply pressure, try and think creatively about win-win diplomatic scenarios. But just solely relying on charisma and charm, I don't think is going to win any meaningful concessions in our bilateral negotiations with our adversaries.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Michael Allen, really appreciate your time. Well, just days before Russia's annual May 9th Victory Day parade, a celebration marking the end of the Second World War, 4 Ukrainian drones were intercepted as they approached the Russian capital, Moscow. Well, President Putin has called for a 72-hour ceasefire to mark this event, starting on the 8th of May. This as the capital prepares to host a major military parade with foreign leaders in attendance. Well, let's cross to the Ukrainian capital now, and we can speak to Solomiia Bobrovska, who is a member of the Defense and Intelligence Committee in Ukraine's parliament, who joins us from Kyiv. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to see you. We've had this unilateral ceasefire announced by Moscow, 72 hours of ceasefire to mark the Victory Day in the Second World War. That's going to happen later on this week. What we've heard so far from the Ukrainian president makes it sound like he's not very convinced by this offer. Why not?
Because we don't want to play Putin's game anymore. His so-called generous gesture is just a gesture for Russians. We saw what happened on Easter night when he promised the same, and we just saw literally just a small decreasing of the shellings on the front line, but nothing extraordinary ceasefire happened. We knew that he wanted to, Putin wanted to have the ceasefire for the 9th of May. He's worrying, by the way, about the security situation during the parade. That's why, for example, they refused to hold parades, by the way, in Crimea and in other region centers which have borders with the Ukrainian territory. So that's only his gesture. Instead, we propose to have the 30 days of ceasefire. And what we heard as a response from Lavrov and Russian side, that they are not ready and they're not accepting our proposal. So that's just only the special game for Russians during their very holy day of the victory, when they name only Russians to win the Second World War.
Okay, so if Russia announces unilateral 72-hour ceasefires, why doesn't Ukraine try doing the same and seeing what the response is? We will, as usual, we are acting, in response. We're not attacking, we're just responding. I bet they can decrease the shells, the attacks, but no one promised that they won't attack, for example, Kyiv or Odessa or whatever. But instead, again, we're proposing the 30 days ceasefire, which Putin again and again is refusing. We don't want to play just his game to give the very political, not promises, but his strong words for Russians. There is no sense anymore. I mean, a lot of the analysts we talk to say that as a result of a short ceasefire, usually longer than 72 hours, but nevertheless a short ceasefire, you can build something. You can get, the countries going in a direction that's less conflictual and more oriented towards finding a longer-term solution. Do you see that working?
No, to be honest, during the Easter night when we had all this one-day ceasefire, we haven't seen so much differences between the ceasefire and not ceasefire. So again, we have to accept this as a very Putin's game, I would say, where he wants to involve Ukraine. We're ready for peace, we're ready for negotiations, we're ready for 30 days, but we don't want to play his game on a very special, his day of victory, where he will host, by the way, the European leaders as well. I don't know even what to comment more on that. Every time Ukraine is not attacking, but responding.
Okay. Obviously there's been an upsurge in the number of attacks carried out by Russia on Ukraine in the last couple of days. There's nothing to suggest. There were 200 attacks on Saturday alone. There's nothing to suggest, is there, that we are sort of winding down or heading into a more peaceful chapter, is there?
Absolutely. That's what we are trying to say for our very closest allies, US. So the day are passing, the negotiations about an agreement on minerals that's signed from the both sides and so on, and you see how aggressive Russians are. Moreover, you see only these terroristic attacks on civilians, on civil infrastructure. Yes, that's in Kyiv, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa. But I would say that they're preparing to attack the number of the targets and cities and small towns through the whole front line, and they have the several of them. I mean, the towns where they're planning to have their offensive operations. So that's not a surprise for us, unfortunately, and we truly understand that they are planning as they are stronger, I would say now, in this all negotiations, in this all things that they're doing on the front line. They are planning to attack. So the more they're talking about the ceasefire, the more they attacked. That's a very typical rule and law, I would say, even for Russians style.
Yeah, we heard President Putin talking at the weekend in an interview saying that he hopes we don't have to use nuclear weapons in this war in Ukraine. Why do you think he's saying that right now?
That's a very good question. I think when every time it goes to any negotiations, he's starting to, to talk about the nuclear and start to play with our partners, even I would say. So the more he's putting like the price and the tensions, the more allies will make a step back from the all negotiations and all the conditions. And every time Ukraine in a very weak with the weak conditions and a weak side. That's the problem. So when we hear Trump and when he said, by the way, that for one side he's more closer, for the other is not. I truly believe that he's closer more to Russians. We see how many times Witkov now, especially envoy in Russia, is in Russia. How close he is to Putin and to all his colleagues, and we see what U.S. demands from Ukraine, and we see how Russia is attacking Ukraine, and we don't see actually, even the promising receiving of the military aid, as for example Patriots. That's unfortunately one of the only ammunition weapon we can use as the air defense. That is one of the weakest things we have in Ukraine. So I think probably the negotiations now are on the very maybe sensitive point where Russia again want to blackmail, that they are stronger and they want to receive as much as they want.
Okay, I mean, ever since President Trump returned to the White House, he's been saying he wants to broker peace, he wants to end what he called the bloodbath. That's the language he used. And here we are, 105 days into his second term as president. Why has he not managed, do you think, to broker a 30-day ceasefire as Ukraine and others had hoped?
Yes, I think when he was running in elections for the position, I'm not sure he was very deep in the details on what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. He remembered Ukrainian Biden's negotiations and deals and issues and scandals and discussions between U.S. and Ukraine. I bet as a majority actually in his team, Biden's team, and among American officials, as it happened when the full-scale invasion started, they had, this false imagination about the mentality and Ukraine and so on. So, and that's why it's really very hard and difficult to, in 100 days to realize that's not that picture as you imagined, that it's much more complicated. And it's not only about Zelensky and Putin. It's not only about the Russia and Ukraine. That's about Ukraine as an instrument of the next moving and spreading this Russian pro-Russian world to the Europe. One of the things that ambitious is to bring back Ukraine to USSR. That ambitious is to literally make the genocide and again put the Soviet people or pro-Russian people in Ukraine. And it's not only about, killing people and each other, and I will stop in one day, and if not me, no one will stop the war. It's much more complicated. But fortunately or unfortunately, Ukraine, that will be the milestone for foreign policy, for Trump's foreign policy. Because if we lose, the next will be Taiwan that he is looking at so much. Then their interests, American interests in the Middle East, and so on and so on. So we are just, despite we're in Europe, we are very, very bright example of how U.S. can lead leadership or not. I would say that's minus. It's much more complicated than he thought. That's why it's impossible to make this in 30 days, 100 days, and so on and so on. If you really want to compete and to be on the same level with the China, US, they have finally to find other solution where they cannot move only by the Moscow needs and to play their game.
Do you think the Trump administration has tried to do too much too quickly? Obviously, they're trying to do lots of things in the first 100 days, which have now passed. Do you think it would be better to wait and perhaps have negotiations to broker an end to this war later in the year? Perhaps when they've understood the issues a bit better, and you're suggesting that perhaps they haven't fully grasped the complexity of all of this. And that's actually, interestingly, exactly what Moscow's been saying. But does Ukraine want to hold out for later in the year? I can understand a very logical argument for wanting the war to stop tomorrow. But in terms of a desirable outcome, would it be better to wait?
But wait for what? That's a problem. I don't mean that that's a problem in the time. As soon as it's possible to finish and to stop and to have ceasefire, from my point of view, is better. That's on the one hand. On the other, I'm a little bit frightened that Trump's administration and all this team. It's not only about the speed and time. It's about, too fast decisions, which are not well prepared, well thought, well communicated, well understandable to all the partners. And all the speed in this decision making can make very huge troubles. That's from the other one side. From the other side, what Ukrainians see for the last 60 or 70 days, when he started to try to find the peace deal, that's about very pro-Russian position in the White House, and all these things which J.D. Vance allowed to show to our president when they had the meeting in Oval Office, and all these tweets, it's unstoppable tweets on Ukraine and Russia. I don't think that's play the good things to stop the war. Maybe they're trying to play with Putin, but at the end, KGB always, unfortunately, wins CIA.
Yeah, one thing we heard at the weekend when President Zelensky visited the Czech Republic came from the Czech president, Petr Pavel, who said President Putin can end this war with one decision, but so far he hasn't shown any willingness to do that. What do you think is the right approach here? Because the United States is going for this rapprochement approach. There could be talks, there could be a direct meeting between President Putin and President Trump during the weeks ahead. Or should they go for the turning up the hostility approach, which we've had for several years and it hasn't worked so far? And which is the right approach?
You mean the meeting between Trump and Putin?
Between the United States and Russia.
And Russia. I'm hesitating. If it goes about Ukraine, 2 points it has to be taken into consideration. It has to be Europe sitting nearby, and it has to be Ukraine as well. Because nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine from the one side. But from the other, if you're talking about Europe, Europe has to be the equal partner in this discussion and in this meeting. Otherwise, we saw this 2 or 3 times meeting between Russians and Americans who are talking about Ukraine and going back to business as usual in Russia and in US. And probably you saw the reaction of Ukrainian side as well. So like if it's not made a decision with Ukraine, there's nothing to talk about Ukraine. So it's too much breaking the lines. You know, we don't need any more new brokers, I would say, in between Russia and Ukraine. We need the platforms or allies who can just somehow to stick it together. I would say that's my response for that.
And what's morale like in Ukraine right now? I mean, obviously, the country's had so much to get used to and to process these last 3 years. I mean, a very difficult time for Ukrainian people. But then geopolitical tides have moved so quickly as well, and we've got a totally different approach to all of this from a new president in the White House. How is morale right now?
To be honest, people are exhausted. I don't even command the morale among the soldiers and among the front. I think it's obvious. But on the other hand, when Russia started to attack more and more at night, just civilian buildings, killing people, children, you know, and what we see, what they're doing for the last 15, 20 days, you know, it's not only demoralizing, of course, and exhausted people and frightened people, because that's a pure terrorism. But on the other hand, we're going back to US side, and that's not understanding what position US is holding, because we were trying to rely on them, and at the end we see what we see. It's more and more Russia is more and more started to be aggressive and attacking, and especially, for example, in the Palm Sunday. Yes, you remember the Sumy, how they just strike the people on the streets and buses and so on. I would say it's hard. Thanks God, it started to be warmer outside, and sun gives a hope, literally. But people are exhausted. People do not understand, and I would say they are lost in understanding what to expect the next, and that's the problem.
Okay, just lastly, Solomiia, if you had a message or an opportunity to speak to President Trump, if he gave you 60 seconds of his time, what would you tell him?
To President Putin or to President Trump?
President Trump.
Putin.
President Trump. If you had an opportunity to deliver a message, a 60-second message to President Trump, what would that be?
Come to Ukraine. Come to Ukraine and see by your own eyes what's going on and what Russia is doing. The only one. Just come to Ukraine, or welcome to Ukraine. That's the only one message. And I think that will explain everything for him, what he's doing and how to not to comment just looking through the JV events, Facebook Reels or Instagram Reels.
Okay. Well, if he's watching, I hope that message is communicated. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Solomiia Bobrovska.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.